Good afternoon, welcome. I am Digby Ricci and we continue our series of lectures celebrating the genius of Shakespeare, brushing up the bard. This is the third lecture concentrating on the language and imagery of Shakespeare's early love tragedy, Romeo and Juliet. My previous lecture concluded by examining the manner in which a surrender to passion, the abandonment of reason, makes one vulnerable to the arbitrary destructiveness of fortune. Fortune, which was often depicted as a wheel-spinning goddess in medieval and Renaissance times. By discarding thought, Romeo destroys the strongest embankment, to use Machiavelli's term, that he has to protect himself from the threats of fortune. To refer once more to Act 2, Scene 3, and to the friar's discussion of the poisoning and healing properties of plants and flowers, I want to emphasize a very significant analogy that the friar draws, one that is central to Romeo and Juliet as a whole. Friar Lawrence states, "Two such opposed kings encamp them still," and still means always there, "in man as well as plants, grace and rude will. And where the worser is predominant, full soon the canker death eats up the plant." In this remarkable metaphor that stresses the opposing kings that dwell within all human beings, Friar Lawrence is emphasizing the fact that every one of us is torn apart by conflict between passion and reason. Grace means God-given virtue, thought, and control. Rude will is uncontrolled passion, a commitment to emotion and desire. And when rude will dominates, we are indeed destroyed. And this is why, of course, the friar constantly advocates caution and reason. Immediately before the death of the aggressive Mercutio at the hands of the even more aggressive, warlike Tybalt, Romeo does behave with grace. He is, after all, newly wed in secret, and therefore he is related to Tybalt. Tybalt is a cousin to Romeo by marriage, and therefore he attempts to placate the fiery Tybalt by using charm and rationality. He does not succeed. Enraged by the death of his dear friend Mercutio, Romeo then rejects as effeminate a commitment to love and maintaining peace. He fights Tybalt and kills him. This is the triumph of rude will, and it has devastating effects. It leads to Romeo's exile, and that, of course, accelerates the tragedy. So, surrendering to rude will ensures that you make yourself a tragic victim of the fickle goddess Fortune. You become Fortune's fool, plaything, or puppet. The debasing effects of Romeo's rejection of the intricacies of thought for the brutal simplifications of blind emotion are certainly emphasized in the scene in which he laments his plight in Friar Lawrence's cell, which you will find in Act 3, Scene 3. Romeo's grief-stricken excesses provoke the friar to condemn him as a kind of lusus naturae, to use the Latin phrase, a freak of nature. The friar insists that Romeo seems to be composed of a man, an unseemly woman at this point, and a beast. He says, "Thy wild acts denote the unreasonable fury of the beast." Romeo's extreme grief expresses itself in rhetorical flourishes which are disturbingly reminiscent of the kind of language he used when he was infatuated with Rosaline. There is self-dramatizing indulgence in his despair. We see this in his petulant rejection of the friar's compassion and common sense, and also in the hyperbolical description of himself as being worse off than carrion flies, flies that feast upon dead meat. After the profundity and ardour of his encounters with Juliet, Romeo lapses into the emotions of the self-afflicted, pining lover, complete with facile displays of verbal skill. This is, of course, somewhat disappointing for the reader, but we are aware of the fact that Romeo is indeed in a terrible position and is suffering intensely. And his next meeting with Juliet, their wedding night, restores the intensity and courage which he has temporarily abandoned. In response to Juliet's sorrowful, "More light and light it grows, Romeo must leave her," as the dawn brightens, Romeo responds, "More light and light, more dark and dark our woes." There is nothing excessive, theatrical, or affected about these words. They are genuinely poetic, heightened yet accurate expression of the sorrow and loss of the lover's situation. Significantly, despite the nurse's claim that after Tybalt's death, Juliet's grief is as hysterical in its expression as Romeo's, the nurse says, "Oh, he is even in my mistress's case, just in her case." Shakespeare never shows us Juliet reduced to such a blubbering, debased condition of excessive passion, as Romeo briefly is. Juliet's single collapse into uncontrolled feeling is justified by the extreme fear and danger of her situation. It occurs when she attempts to prepare herself psychologically for entering into the state of living death, which will enable the friar's desperate scheme to succeed. You will find this marvellous passage in Act 4, Scene 3. At this stage, Juliet's emotions are heightened to an almost hallucinatory extent, and she has nightmarish visions of a premature awakening in the tomb. These visions are luridly intensified by horror and disgust. Juliet's imagination creates an awakening accompanied by assaults upon every one of her senses by the atmosphere and the contents of the Capulet's ancient receptacle of death. The stench of the tomb, she fears, will stifle her. Shrieks as terrible as the madness-inducing screams of uprooted mandrakes will assault her ears. The corpse of Tybalt will devastate her sight, and she sees his corpse as combining the ghastliness of recent mutilation. She now imagines him as mangled with that of decay. She says Tybalt is festering in his shroud. So cacophony, loathsome smells, and a climactic supernatural visitation. "Methinks I see my cousin's ghost," she cries. These are the stuff of an outraged, terrified recoil from the horrors of death. Why do we as readers or viewers criticize Romeo's temporary collapse into extreme and self-indulgent despair, and yet sympathize so strongly with Juliet's fragmented, hysterical outburst of aversion to the tomb? I think my final phrase says it all. It is because we know that what she is expressing is aversion to the tomb. And this aversion moves us rather than alienates us, because it underlines her courage in embracing the friar's scheme at all. Nowhere is her bravery more evident than at this point, for she accepts a condition which all her youthful vitality and joy rejects completely. She shrinks from the Capulet's ancient receptacle of death with fear and disgust. Mercutio's macabrely punning exit from life. You remember he says, "Ask for me tomorrow and you will find me a grave man." Certainly has a punning stylishness about it, but real heroism is present in Juliet's willingness to enter the tomb in order to save her relationship. In a brilliant short book on Shakespeare, the great feminist scholar Germaine Greer, whom I've quoted earlier in these lectures, states that Juliet is a child of great seriousness and heroic intent. And Greer also asserts that as Romeo and Juliet, the text progresses, so, quote, "a character of true tragic dimensions emerges, young Juliet, and she herself makes of her co-protagonist also a hero." And that, I think, is spot on. The young lovers do indeed develop and mature. There may be lapses, Romeo's descent into self-indulgent despair, for example, but by the time the play concludes, not only the dignified and perceptive Juliet, but also the often flawed and mistaken Romeo possess tragic grandeur. Indeed, just before Romeo commits suicide, Shakespeare gives his male protagonist language that is so aesthetic, so passionate, that it serves as an agonizing reminder to us as readers and viewers of how much is lost when Romeo perishes. As Romeo looks at what he thinks is the corpse of Juliet in the Capulet's tomb, he uses images of radiance, and radiance has always been associated with Juliet throughout the play, that are deeply moving. The metaphors of radiance culminate in the idealizing conceit of the transforming power of Juliet's presence, even in the tomb. Her beauty, Romeo says, transforms the tomb into a lantern and then into a feasting presence. Now, the great lexicographer and Shakespearean scholar Alexander Schmidt glosses lantern in this context as a turret full of windows, and he glosses feasting presence in this context as a banqueting hall, a state room of great splendor. So, Romeo's intensifying sense of loss causes him to increase his tribute, to intensify his imagery. The splendor that Juliet bestows on the tomb is enlarged from a turret into a state room full of light, blazing with light. However, Romeo's final eulogy, if one can call it that, is not expressed in spiritualized terms alone. He rejoices in Juliet's defiantly lingering physical charms, the crimson that remains in her lips and cheeks, and his tribute culminates in an embrace and a kiss. Romeo's last words provide a poignant restatement of what the entire play is about, the rare union that the lovers have achieved. There is ongoing debate about whether Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy of circumstance, of fortune, star-crossed lovers take their life, or human fallibility, or, as is most plausible, and as I believe, all of those. But this debate should not, and does not, lessen an audience's sorrowful response to the enormity of the loss that has occurred in the play. As the lover's language reveals, in Romeo and Juliet's relationship, the fire of the heart and the fire of the soul become united, and the tragedy of the play is that such a union is so short-lived. Shakespeare's text was inspired by a popular narrative poem, itself a translation. The poem is The Tragical History of Romeos and Juliet by Arthur Brooke, and it was published in 1562. Brooke, however, is very severe on the two lovers. He speaks of them as a couple of unfortunate lovers, thralling themselves, imprisoning themselves in a sense, to unhonest, as he calls it, unhonest desire, thralling themselves to unhonest desire. So Brooke's poem is, in a sense, quite a prim and condemnatory work, so very different from Shakespeare's great love tragedy. Shakespeare certainly looks at human fallibility, and the two lovers, especially Romeo, are not free of errors. But human fallibility is lamented by Shakespeare, and human potential is celebrated. Born, as I have emphasized, into a situation of nightmarish inversion, the world of the brutal, ongoing, irrational feud, Romeo and Juliet do achieve a great love. Different and inadequate definitions of love are explored in the text, ranging from the gross and cruel sexuality of the servants to the witty but constantly denigratory view of sexual relationships of Mercutio, from the crass bawdiness of the nurse to the coldly materialistic and status-oriented matchmaking of Lady Capulet. These definitions of love are certainly explored and found wanting. Ultimately, the real tragedy of Romeo and Juliet is not the tragedy of two hot teenagers who die young. It is rather the tragedy of two extraordinary people who are able to achieve a love which unites spirituality and desire, the body and the soul, and this union is doomed. And that's the true tragedy, our overwhelming sense of loss. An ideal is achieved, but an ideal is achieved for such a heartbreakingly short time. This seems to be an appropriate point at which to end the series of lectures on one of Shakespeare's most beloved plays. Before I conclude, however, I must acknowledge that the text I used for these lectures is the Bankside edition of Romeo and Juliet, which I co-edited with that great South African Shakespearean scholar, Miss Hilary Semple. Many of you would have noticed that during the course of these lectures on Romeo and Juliet, I referred in some detail to an essay. And you might well have thought, good heavens, he's simply reading from a text. He's plagiarizing. I am not. Have no fears. The essay to which I referred in great detail is my own essay, an essay I wrote a number of years ago, of which I'm still very proud. It was published in the South African journal called Crux, a journal for the teaching of English, and it was published in 1990. And it is indeed an essay on the language of love, power, cruelty in Romeo and Juliet. I look forward to speaking to you again upon matters literary. Please like and what's to dislike, and subscribe to my channel. And this is goodbye for the moment from me. Okay.
I should leave that in.